Hello, students, and welcome back to our tour of Asia. We have completed the Middle East and Siberia, and now we're going to another fascinating part of this massive continent, and that would be the Indian subcontinent. First of all, why is it called the Indian subcontinent? What is a subcontinent? That's an interesting question. Now, in Earth Science with Mr. Gracie, you probably studied Pangaea. Okay, Pangaea, the giant continental landmass, when the scientists believed that all of the continents were together in one big giant landmass, okay, and that the plates that they were on began separating and floating apart. India, according to this theory, was part or near East Africa, and then they started to separate and move in various directions. And India, you can see on this bottom picture here, India made its way north across what was the Indian Ocean, or is now the Indian Ocean, and slammed into Asia. And that slamming into Asia created the highest mountain range in the world, and it's still growing a few millimeters every year because India is still kind of pushing its way into the Asian continent, even now. And so that is why it's considered almost a separate landmass from the rest of Asia. It's considered a unique landmass, so they call it the Indian subcontinent. Now, what countries are in the Indian subcontinent? Well, there are several. We have India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, which is the island off the Indian coast, and Bhutan, that mysterious Buddhist kingdom that Paul did his presentation on very well during the geography fair. Now, the whole subcontinent, all the people make up 1.7 billion people live in in those countries. And that's about 22% of the world's total population live in the Indian subcontinent. Now, one of the things you need to understand about this is that India used to be ruled by Great Britain or the United Kingdom, right? It was part of the British Empire. And they considered those five countries, all of them were just called India. Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, everyone, they just said, this is India. And they didn't make a separation between the countries in that area. All of those countries were ruled by Great Britain. This was known as the British Raj, which is a Sanskrit or Hindustani word for the word rule. So it's the British rule. And the British Raj ruled from 1858 to 1947. Now, in 1947, after World War II, the British Empire began, because of the expense of maintaining a massive empire, their rule wasn't very popular in the Indian subcontinent, so there were pressures from the world for them to abandon the British Raj, which they did in 1947. They were going to try to extend it over a couple of years, their leaving of Britain, but the tensions grew, and so they left in 1947. Now, there were great religious tensions between the Muslims and the Hindus at this time. And it became apparent that they weren't going to exist in independent countries side by side. So what happened was called the partition, where the largely Hindu populations of India stayed in India, or people from Pakistan who were Hindu migrated back to India, and many of the Muslims, not all of them by any stretch of the imagination, but many Muslims um, went from India to Pakistan. Now, and that became known as the partition, how the country was divided, parted. All right. It was not a peaceful transition, and anywhere from 500,000 to 1.5 million people died during that splitting of the Indian subcontinent. East Pakistan is today called Bangladesh. It used to be part of Pakistan. The country was divided into two regions that were separated by India, but there was still only one country. And that became untenable after several years of that. So in 1971, East Pakistan became its own independent country, and that was called Bangladesh. Now, one of the most fascinating geographic elements involved in studying the Indian subcontinent is the monsoon. India, during a large part of the year, is very dry. There's not a lot of rain in India. And yet there are 1 point in the subcontinent, 1.7 billion people who live, and 1.3 billion people in India who live and rely on everyone has need of water for crops. It's a largely agricultural society. So where does the water come from? Well, there is some snow melt that comes out of the Himalayas, but that is not sufficient to support that number of people. And for centuries, what they have relied on are these massive rainstorms that occur between June and September in India. All right. And they are called the monsoon rains. All right. The monsoon rains are the monsoon rains, sorry, I had to hang up my phone there. The monsoon rains are this basically what monsoon means is a change in the wind direction. When the when wind direction changes, uh, unusual things happen with the weather. So here's basically how it works. From January and also in the fall as well, but primarily from January to May, the dominant winds that go across India are coming from the northeast. And you can see over here that green arrow, that represents the northeast winds that come from China and Tibet. And in January, obviously, they're cool winds, but they're still dry. But when it gets closer to May, these winds grow very, very hot. And that water supply, whatever water they had left, begins to dry up. The wells begin to have mud at the bottom and not water. And so essentially, they're waiting for water to come because their animals, their herds will start dying. They don't have enough to plant the crops and do all of those things. And this happens every year on the Indian subcontinent. In one day, sometime usually early in June, the wind will shift. It will stop coming from the northeast and start coming from the southwest, from the Arabian Sea, from the Indian Ocean. And when that cool, wet air from the Arabian Sea and Indian Ocean meets that hot, dry air mass, massive, massive amounts of rainfall. I am talking massive. Um, there is great celebration. You know how when we drew pictures of the weather here, the clouds are usually mean and frowny faced and the sun is usually smiling. There in India, the sun is not smiling. The sun is an angry, evil look, and the clouds are smiling because they look forward to this rain. Look at the picture of the boys up here in the flood. They're having a great time. This is what they've been waiting for. It means they're going to be able to live and grow food and survive, water being a necessity for all human life. This man over here, this famous picture over here, is a picture of a man who was a tailor in a town, and he's up to his neck in water, and he's carrying his sewing machine through the water. But notice, he's smiling. We don't smile around floods and flooding. These people rejoice in the floods and flooding. It means they're going to survive another year. They're going to have enough food to feed all of the people on the continent. Now, Vasinram is a town, it's considered the wettest place on earth. It's in India, just in the foothills of the Himalayas. And during the monsoon season in June and July, if you can imagine this, during this season, the town receives over 200 inches of rain. And the annual rainfall total averages about 400 inches of rain. And in 1985, this town set a record where they had 1,000 inches of rain. So we may complain about rain in Pittsburgh, but if you lived in Mosinram, you would be complaining probably a lot more. 1,000 inches of rain in a year is an awful lot. So now we're going to go through the three major countries of the Indian subcontinent, talk a little bit about them and what is unique about them. And the first one we're going to cover is Pakistan. There is a state in Pakistan, or a province in Pakistan, known as the Punjab. And Punjab means 5 rivers, and you see a picture of it up here. Okay, the 5 rivers are the 4 rivers that form the Indus River and they all meet and form the Indus River, and then there's one other river that is independent. So literally Punjab means five waters, and they're tributaries. That is, they feed the Indus River. A tributary is water that runs from one river into a larger river, and that larger river in this case is the Indus River. This, if you remember our earlier lecture on Asia, this is where the Harappan civilization was founded in the Punjab region. Now, 97% of the people in the Punjab are followers of Islam, the religious tradition of Islam. And among the traditions of Islam is an interesting one called concerning women, where women live in purdah. And what does that mean? That means they live behind the veil or behind the curtain. You see a photograph up here of what it means to live in purdah, that you are completely covered and only your eyes are showing when you live in the more traditional households. And even more so in those traditional households, in purdah means that the men and women live in separate sections of the house to protect the integrity of women according to Islamic tradition. Now, sadly, yeah, in the stricter forms of Islam, especially under one form of it run by a political group called the Taliban, they do not believe that young women should be educated. And in 2012, there was a young woman named Malala. You see her down there. I'm not even going to try that last name, but her name was Malala, and she was a young Pakistani girl, and she defied the local government, and she said young women should be educated. And this had been going on for 3 years, but she was causing great tension among the government leaders there. And an assassin tried to kill her. She was on her way home from a bus. They shot her at the age of 15 on her way home from school. And 2 years later, at the age of 17, she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2014, and she became the youngest woman ever to receive the award. And you see one of her beautiful statements: one child, one teacher, one pen, and one book can change the world. Now, in India, we're going to cover that next. India is an amazing country. 1.35 billion people live in the country of India. Now, you would think, oh, there are all these cities. There must be all these cities. But in fact, that's not the case. Most people in India live in small villages in the rural setting. They don't live in an urban setting. In fact, 70% of people in India live in those rural villages rather than in cities like Mumbai or Kolkata. Okay, so in this, they are largely farmers, because to grow enough food to support 1.35 billion people is quite a chore, especially in a monsoon climate. And pictured here, you'll see women. They're replanting the rice shoots that they've started growing in the earlier part of the monsoon season. They replant each rice plant by hand. Those are rice plants they're replanting in India. Okay, and 31% of their population, which is significant when you're talking about 1.35 billion people, is engaged in agricultural production, and they produce the world's largest amount of many fruits such as bananas and mangoes and papaya, lemons, and vegetables such like chickpeas, right? They're the world's second largest producer of rice behind China, and the second largest producer of wheat as well. And they produce enough food not only to feed their population, but to be a major exporter of food as well. Now, religiously speaking, Pakistan, like I said, is Islamic. Hinduism is the main religion of India. About 80% of the population is Hindu. And here you see one of their colorful and beautiful Hindu temples, all right, in India. They're just stunning looking, just an amazing, amazing feats of architecture. Then we're going to go to Bangladesh. Welcome to Bangladesh. That, remember, was East Pakistan until 1971. Bangladesh is where two major rivers meet. One is the Brahmaputra, which you know, and the Ganges, the holiest river in all of India. They meet in Bangladesh and they form one massive delta. That's where the mouth of a river kind of grows and keeps getting larger. All right. And this massive delta is where the most densely populated delta in the world is there. Naturally, with a monsoon climate and two rivers like that, water is a Water flooding is a major problem in this vicinity. But again, it also supports some amazing agriculture. What do they do there? They produce rice, tea, sugarcane in this region. But one of their unique crops, India produces more of this, but Bangladesh, for whatever reason, is more known for it, is jute. Okay, Jute. And they produce 70% of the jute exports in the world. And what it is, it's like a natural fiber, like you make cloth out of it, or rope in some cases, or sack. So this would be like carpet backing. This would be a sack you'd make and rope over here. And these are the ute plants themselves, okay? Um, so all of these things, they also use it. If you've ever seen when they're doing construction on the side of the road and you see these rolls of things that are there to stop the dirt from coming out in the road when they're doing the construction, those are used in farming in a lot of areas. But ute rolls, like similar to the matting that looks like this, are made into these giant rolls, and that prevents the soil from washing away through erosion. So ute is a major crop. In India and in Bangladesh. In fact, Bangladesh is responsible for 70% of the world's exports in jute. It used to be the #1 producer. India surpassed it recently. And then finally, there are two countries. I'm not going to talk about Sri Lanka. Um, we can talk about that at some other point. But there are two isolated countries that are part of the Indian subcontinent. One is Nepal, and the other is Bhutan. Nepal is a country in the Himalayan mountains, and part of Mount Everest, the tallest mountain in the world, is in Nepal. The other half of Mount Everest is in China. And it has become this major, of all things, adventure tourism kind of thing, where these crazy people live around the world who apparently don't have enough excitement in their life, think it would be a really cool idea to climb Mount Everest. And here you see the fact that it's not this big and isolated climb. You'll see this is a line of people. I didn't even show the whole thing, trying to get to the summit of Mount Everest. So you get up there and there's a crowd. There's like a line waiting to get to the top, and you see people going down and you see people going up. Crazy stuff to make that effort. And it's also very dangerous. Many people have died trying to reach the summit of Mount Everest. And finally, the last country is Bhutan. It's a mysterious country, very isolated. It doesn't have very much contact with the outside world. It very much limits the number of people who can visit it, and it's a Buddhist kingdom. And pictured here is the palace of the king of Bhutan. So that is our little tour of the Indian subcontinent. I hope you enjoyed it. Take notes and get ready yet for another quiz on another region of Asia. Thank you so much for listening.